What if the main character in one of the world's most influential books isn't at all who we think he is? Today, we're diving into a really fascinating analysis that puts the God of the Bible on trial, and believe me, it challenges some incredibly fundamental ideas. Now, the source we're looking at from an author named Sui Feng doesn't just toss the Bible aside, not at all. It actually calls it a treasure of human wisdom. But it also argues that this treasure has a huge fundamental problem right at its very core. So what is this problem? Well, this central claim is about as bold as it gets. Here it is. The God of the Bible is not the true God. Wow. Now, to make a case like that, you can't just throw out opinions. You have to start with a really clear standard of judgment. So, to critique the biblical God, the author first has to build a benchmark, a set of criteria for what a true God even is. You can think of this framework as the foundation for the entire argument we're about to unpack. According to this source, a true God isn't something defined by faith alone. Nope, it's a being that absolutely must have a specific set of fundamental characteristics. The author's approach here is pretty logical. Create a test that you can actually measure against. And here they are, the 8 essential traits. You've got oneness and formlessness, so singular and without a physical body. Then neutrality and justice. Wisdom, and that includes knowing the future. Benevolence, which is just pure goodness. Omnipotence, all-powerful. And finally, woming, which basically means having no ignorance. This is the scorecard we're going to use. Okay, with that standard all set up, the author gets right into the evidence, starting at the very beginning, the Garden of Eden. And the source presents this whole story as a kind of paradox. So the author completely flips this classic story on its head. Instead of it being a tale of human failure, the argument here is that it's a story that reveals a God who is actually incompetent, who lacks foresight, and who is, in the end, unjust. To really drive this point home, the author uses this amazing analogy. Like an architect whose building collapses, should he blame the building or himself? The argument is pretty clear, right? Creating humans who fail immediately, well, that doesn't point to a human flaw. It points to a design flaw. The source argues that the fault lies with the creator for 3 big reasons. First, a flawed design in Adam and Eve themselves. Second, a much more powerful being, Satan, was the real one pulling the strings. And third, God himself put the source of temptation, that tree of knowledge, right smack in the middle of the garden. And this leads to a really sharp question about justice. Why punish humanity, who is seen here as the victim, instead of the actual instigator, Satan? The source even compares it to blaming a child for being assaulted instead of going after the attacker. That is a very powerful critique. The critique doesn't stop at Eden, not by a long shot. The next case study digs into other Old Testament stories to question the biblical God's morality, and it focuses on what the source calls cruelty and contradiction. This slide just lays out a key contradiction from the story of the 10 plagues so clearly. On one hand, you have God telling Pharaoh, "Let my people go," but on the other hand, the text says over and over, "I will make Pharaoh's heart hard." So the author is essentially asking, is this a fair test or is it just a setup? And according to the source, this setup leads to some truly escalating cruelty. The plagues aren't framed as a righteous punishment against some evil tyrant. No, they're framed as collective punishment against an entire population, including innocent animals and people who had absolutely no say in what Pharaoh did. The final plague is presented as the ultimate example of this injustice. The source asks, why punish the common people? Why kill the children of the lowest servants, the people with zero power? As the quote says, the author considers this demonic behavior, not divine justice. The analysis of divine justice keeps going, and now it moves to another foundational story, Cain and Abel. And here, the author argues that God doesn't just show favoritism, but he actively protects a criminal. So it all starts with the offerings. Cain brings produce, Abel brings the best of his flock. God accepts Abel's gift but rejects Cain's. The source argues that by showing this preference without any clear reason, God himself is the one who lights the fuse of jealousy that leads directly to the very first murder. But the author's real key point is what happens after the murder. God's response isn't just to punish Cain. He also actively protects him from anyone seeking revenge, declaring that whoever kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. And so, the source just puts the question out there, plain and simple. Is this justice, or is this protecting a murderer? The implication here is that this action sets a really dangerous precedent, where crime is actually shielded by divine authority. Okay, so after examining these case studies, Eden, the plagues, Cain and Abel, the author is ready to deliver a final verdict. The God of the Bible has been tried against those 8 characteristics we set up at the very beginning. So let's just recap the case. According to this source, the biblical God fails the test. The fall suggests a lack of foresight. The stories of Eden and Cain show a failure of justice. The plagues demonstrate cruelty, not benevolence. And the events with Pharaoh and Cain show favoritism and a tendency to actually engineer conflict. So in the end, the source concludes this God does not meet the 8 criteria for a true God. And all of this leads to the source's definitive conclusion, stated without a shred of hesitation. It can be said with certainty, the God in the Bible is not the true God. So what's the big takeaway here? This analysis leaves us with one final and really challenging question. If the God portrayed in the Bible fails this logical test, then what or who would pass it? It's a question that really challenges us to think critically about the very definition of divinity.